This week, Apple hosted an online event called Unleashed, and the expectations prior to the event was that Apple would show new MacBook Pros with updated M1 processors. And we got them with a little bit more than expected. The stars of the show were definitely the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, and also the M1 Pro and M1 Max processors. And let's start by talking about the processors first. And in this event, Apple CEO Tim Cook, who was standing in some kind of field, stated that Apple is currently in the first year of a 2-year transition to Apple Silicon across its Mac line. In terms of their product offerings, the transition has started from the bottom, with the consumer-grade machines all getting M1 processors. And by consumer-grade, I mean things like the MacBook Air, the entry-level Mac Mini, the entry-level iMac, and the entry-level MacBook Pro. And what they showed today was really for the mid-tier prosumer machines, with the higher spec MacBook Pros going first. I expect to see them put these processors in things like the larger screened iMac and a higher spec Mac Mini in the future. And my guess is that next year we'll probably see a full beans M1 processor, something like a Pro Max, but please don't call it that, in the Mac Pro and possibly another iMac Pro in the future. But for now, let's go back to the M1 Pro and the M1 Max processors. I'm afraid that I lack a little bit of the knowledge to give you a full technical difference between the M1, M1 Pro and M1 Max processors, but I'll do my best. To add some context, I'll be talking about these processors in terms of laptops rather than desktop computers. So for laptops, processors have to have a balance between performance and efficiency. And in terms of efficiency, I mean power efficiency for longer battery life, and also thermal efficiency, so the laptop doesn't have to throttle performance to prevent overheating. And I think the best way to describe the differences between the M1 and the M1 Pro and M1 Max is by their target audiences. So the M1 processor is really for consumers. It's very suitable for general everyday use, so like web, email, content consumption, and occasional content creation. And these M1 processors are optimized more for efficiency rather than outright performance. The thing that really shocked people initially with the M1 is that despite its tune for efficiency, it still beat out higher-end Intel processors of previous generation MacBook Pros in terms of performance. And on the MacBook Air, they even managed to do this without any cooling fans inside it. So the M1 Pro and the M1 Max they showed in this Apple event is really made for, well, professionals mostly. So people who get the machines with these processors have a very specific use case or piece of software in mind. Now, this could be things like a Final Cut Pro, Logic, Xcode, Photoshop, Lightroom, or DaVinci Resolve. And these M1 Pro and Max processors are tuned for performance at the expense of a little bit of efficiency. So compared to the M1 Pro and Max has more CPU cores for processing, GPU cores for graphics, and a thing called a media engine for accelerated video processing. So this means that the M1 Pro and M1 Max have more units to process things and specific units for processing videos. Apple quotes that the CPU is 70% faster than the M1, and the GPU for graphics is 2 times faster than the M1 for the Pro and 4 times faster for the Max. So for video-centric tasks in Final Cut Pro, a piece of software by Apple that I use to edit these videos, a 4K rendering on the new 14-inch MacBook Pro is 9.2 times faster on the M1 Pro processor and 13.4 times faster on the M1 Max processor than the previous 13-inch Intel MacBook Pro that it replaces. So yeah, it's pretty fast. Apple also went to great lengths to say they do all this using much less power than equivalent Intel-based machines with graphs. So all in all, with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, we get significant improvements to performance over Intel-based machines without sacrificing too much efficiency. So after being shown these shiny new M1 Pro and M1 Max processors, we finally got to see the first machine that they'll be going in, the new MacBook Pros. And in some ways, this new MacBook Pro is like a greatest hits remastered version of the MacBook Pro. So to begin with, there's two display sizes. There's a 14-inch display, which is up from 13 in the previous generation, and a 16-inch display. These displays are the latest and greatest new technology from Apple. They call it Liquid Retina XDR with ProMotion. This basically means that the displays are bigger, brighter, have more contrast, and with ProMotion you'll have smoother scrolling as well. And the processors are the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, and the full range of processors are actually available across both machines, which is really nice. I say this because in the previous generation of MacBook Pro, you couldn't get the highest available spec processor in the smaller 13-inch machine. You had to go to the 16-inch machine to get it. And there are now more RAM options. It starts at 16 gigabytes of RAM and goes all the way up to 64 gigabytes of RAM. And there are more SSD capacities as well. It goes all the way up to 8 terabytes. And there's more battery life as well. So Apple quotes 21 hours of video playback on the 16-inch machine. This is in comparison to 11 hours on the previous generation 16-inch Intel MacBook Pro. And you can connect up to 3 Apple Pro Display XDRs as well. And in terms of all the other things, this is now the greatest hits portions of the MacBook Pro. So on this generation of MacBook Pro, ports are cool again. So instead of getting the 4 Thunderbolt USB-C connectors on the previous generation, you now get 3 Thunderbolt 4/USB-C connectors, but you also get a HDMI port and a MagSafe charging port. And yes, MagSafe is back. Apple calls this MagSafe 3, and it's actually quite interesting. It does like super fast charging. So Apple claims that you can get up to 50% battery in 30 minutes, and it requires a separate USB-C to MagSafe cable. You can still charge through the Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports as well, but just not at extra high speeds. And I was really surprised I did MagSafe charging through a MagSafe to USB-C cable rather than having a completely dedicated MagSafe charger. And just like the MagSafe power adapter of old, it attaches using magnets. So if somebody trips over the cable, it just detaches rather than pulling your whole laptop off your desk. Another thing that they brought back was the SD card reader, which is very handy. And speaking of greatest hits, old style keyboards are back as well. So instead of the touch bar, you now get a row of function keys. This time round though, the function keys are actually full size. And the keyboard reminds me of old MacBook Pros with like a black silicone cover over the top of them. And I don't know exactly what it is, but even the design of this new MacBook Pro reminds me of the older ones as well for some reason. And with these MacBook Pros, Apple basically gave the people what they wanted. An updated version of the 2015 MacBook Pro. And this is something that I didn't really expect from new Apple, or I guess you can call it now new Apple. Even if it comes at a cost of some accessory sales for people like us, I really think it was the right thing to do. Enthusiasts really love MacBook Pros, myself included. And I would say that the previous touch bar generations of MacBook Pros were polarizing for a number of reasons. First, and the biggest reason, I think, is the keyboard. They did eventually fix this in the last generation of touch bar MacBook Pros though. The second is dongles and adapters. I'd say that it's much better now than when the machines first came out, but it's nice to have some ports like HDMI and SD card slots back. Third reason is MagSafe being ditched. I actually think this was quite a popular feature in the previous generations of MacBook Pros. And the fourth reason is that people didn't really understand the purpose of the touch bar, and since its release in 2016, it hasn't really been developed by Apple. So I feel, to a lot of enthusiasts, that the touch bar generations of MacBook Pros still look like MacBook Pros, but they didn't really feel like them because of all these things that were missing. And for better or worse, I think it was smart to update these MacBook Pros in conjunction with a processor transition. So this warm fuzzy feeling of getting what we want again is associated with the Apple M1 Pro and Max processors. So the big question is, will I order one? And as of right now, I'm still debating this. So thanks to this YouTube channel, I use Final Cut Pro very regularly now on my 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. And I can tell you that when I edit these videos and I add things like effects, transitions, and titles, my MacBook Pro gets extremely hot and sounds like it's about to like take off or something thanks to the really loud fans. And I bought my machine with 512 gigabytes of SSD, and I've run out of space a few times. Currently, I have 3 external USB-C SSDs attached to it. And so it makes sense for me to get one. But like a lot of Apple things with the Pro designation, it gets pretty pricey. These MacBook Pros in Australia start from $2,999. And that's for the very base spec 14-inch MacBook Pro, which I don't really recommend getting. Because besides a processor with less processing and graphics cores, you also get a slower USB-C charger with it. So in terms of the specs I was looking at the higher spec 14-inch MacBook Pro, which has the 1 terabyte SSD, and it is $3,749. And it only has 16 gigs of RAM. If I go up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, it's like $4,400 or something. And that's a lot of money. We will see. As of filming this video on the 21st of October, the ship dates for Apple Online are now out to mid to late November. So I might just need to go into an Apple store and see these machines for myself and then make a decision. If you did order one though, let me know in the comments what spec you ordered. And lastly, before I go, I just wanted to point out some of the really lovely little nostalgic touches that Apple put into this event. At the very beginning, we see an original iMac that appears to be running OS 9, an old MacBook Pro with MagSafe, the original toilet seat iBook, an iPod, and an iPod Hi-Fi. Also in the HomePod mini section, there was like a small multicolored Apple logo, like the good old days. And I thought that the ads for those new AirPods kind of look like the old iPod ads. And also the MacBook Pros themselves. If I did miss something, let me know in the comments below. And that is it. What did you think of the new M1 Pro and M1 Max processors and the new MacBook Pros? Let me know in the comments below. As always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you again next time.